Welcome back to video lecture 10.3, our last discussion of key themes associated with war photography, and then a setup to the documentary film that we're going to watch together this evening. We've been talking about the power of photography, but in this section, I'd like to highlight an interesting argument, and that is that the United States government doesn't want many people to see some war photography or war images. Now, this won't be a shock or surprise to those of you who've had a chance to read through our Camber and Arango article and the Kimmelman piece for tonight, but it is an interesting area to discuss war photography and censorship questions. Put simply, I'll assert the US government doesn't think we can handle images associated with the costs of the Syrian civil war or the contemporary war on terrorism. For political scientists, we like to think about this in a slightly different way. And that is, we like to talk about a thesis advanced by some political scientists called casualty sensitivity. This is a political science theory of the amount of public sensitivity to the human costs of war and the anticipated effects on policy. Casualty sensitivity is a really interesting area for critical thinking and an interesting argument in political science research. And it goes like this. Political scientists believe that data shows a correlation between the rise of casualty figures in US wars and declining public support for the government's involvement in the war. The more costly the war, the more horrific or tragic the war, the more likely the public is to lose its support, to shift its feelings about what the government is up to. The casualty sensitivity thesis has been advanced by a number of political scientists. It's one that we continue to debate and discuss today in a variety of contemporary settings. But people like Bruce Gentleson in the 1990s, Gelpi, Fever, and Reifler were advancing interesting ideas based on data analysis, public opinion studies. Casualty sensitivity is a thesis. So to extend that idea out, the argument would go something like this. The United States government doesn't want Americans to think about casualties in conflicts or war around the world, doesn't want to encourage that connection, and then can take actions and make policies associated with an effort to try to prevent that connection being made. A good example of the casualty sensitivity at where a hypothesis at work would be the Persian Gulf War, 1990, 1991. This is when the George H.W. administration, George Bush 41, implemented a system for pool reporting for war photography and war journalists. That basically was a system for controlled and guided reporting from the war zone. Granted the Department of Defense control of the images that were being released from US involvement in the Persian Gulf War. So the pool reporting system worked like this. A set of reporters would volunteer to be part of a pool. That would be a group that would represent other reporters, that would be escorted or guided by a US military officer into controlled areas of the war zone, taking images of, say, US soldiers who seemed happy and successful, of achievements like planting the flag in key parts of Kuwait or Afghanistan. That censorship, that control of imagery shaped by the pool reporting structure was one that allowed the George Bush administration to tamp down concerns about casualty sensitivity in the American public. This system has been extended into the modern war on terror as well. The George W. Bush administration, during the war on terror beginning after 9/11, instituted its own measures of control on war photography, control on war images. There was significant censorship in the early years that I'll highlight in brief. One of the strongest barriers or restrictions that the George W. Bush administration had on war photography at the time was controlling images of the return of US war dead, US casualties. Flagged draped coffins flown back from the war zones to the United States became a subject of controversy. And from 9/11 until February 2009, the Defense Department, that's for 8 years effectively, the Defense Department banned photographs of returning US war dead, especially flag draped coffins that might, for example, be delivered to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware and then passed on to family members. Those images were banned. They were censored from publication. It was only after February 2009 that the Department of Defense shifted to a new policy, and that was family member assent. or cooperation and support for sharing those images. It required family permission for those kind of images, powerful images of the costs of war, to be shared more publicly. That means we did not see a lot of images like this powerful still image. The United States public did not see a number of images associated with the costs of war and the war on terror, and therefore maintained somewhat of a distance. Upholding the idea of the casualty sensitivity hypothesis, the Bush administration sought to limit or control the images shared with the American public. This raises interesting questions about censorship, about opportunity and access, about whether the public has the right to see images of US casualties, whether it might ever be acceptable for the government to censor images of war. And by the way, these are really interesting and probing questions, the kinds of questions that if we were in a class meeting together, we would debate and discuss. We'd have a lively exchange, I'm sure, about what kind of limits we saw as reasonable or acceptable to deal with limits and challenges. And I'm sure we would get a nice array of diverse opinions. But for our purposes tonight, we'll just make the connection between these broader questions to the more specific examples raised in our readings in the Camber and Arango article on the debate about war images in the war on terror. And of course, in the controversial Zariah Miller story, the story about Zariah Miller, the war journalist who captured images of US war dead and in the aftermath saw the wrath of the government and effective censorship. Important questions raised that I wish we had an opportunity to debate and discuss in more depth together. But for tonight's purposes, let me move on to set up our investigation, our viewing together of the powerful documentary about the life and times of Tim Hetherington. First, I'll make an easy connection, a segue, and that's Michael Camber, the photojournalist, the author of one of our articles for tonight. He's actually an old friend of photojournalist Tim Hetherington. Camber and Hetherington got to know each other, taking photographs and capturing the experiences of the Liberian Civil War. So many of these photojournalists seem to end up in the same places, right, over the years, capturing the experience. And in this case, Camber and Hetherington, on the left and right of this photograph, became fast friends. Camber describes Hetherington in glowing terms as a positive and creative force. Hetherington's life is made all the more poignant in the documentary that we're going to view for this evening, Which Way is the Front Line from Here? The Life and Times of Tim Hetherington. This film was produced and directed by Hetherington's good friend and colleague, Sebastian Junger. This is an award-winning documentary that captures the experiences of Hetherington and his life across the years, including his powerful photojournalism in the Afghanistan War, his contributions to the documentary film Restrepo, which, by the way, I recommend, is a wonderful extension of the themes we're talking about tonight, and in the years that followed. This documentary, though, of the life and times of Tim Hetherington describes his experiences, his journey, and ultimately the loss of his life, capturing the Arab Spring and the Libyan Civil War. This documentary is powerful, and so I offer the usual content warnings about graphic images of war and profanity. And I'll now ask you to follow the guidelines laid out in the syllabus, giving you a couple of possible links or places where you can view this documentary on your own. Remember that the material from the documentary, general themes, important lessons, and how you felt about them, is testable material, is in bounds for future work. And finally, and last item of class business, don't forget that I've also assigned to you the response paper. We talked about that in video lecture 10.1. Gives you a chance to do more of your own work on photojournalism and its power. And that response paper is due as a Word document attachment paper sent to me by email by next Tuesday, April 14th, by 7 p.m. Worcester time. Thanks so much for your attention. I hope you found this interesting and engaging, and I think you'll appreciate the documentary you're about to see.